Greg Barron-Gafford. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, but you'll correct me. I've seen your presentation before, thanks to a conference organized by University of Arizona a little earlier this year, and I was really amazed. So you are a biogeographer, associate professor at the University of Arizona, and also associate director of the Community and School Garden Program. And your research group studies the interactive effects of vegetation and climate change on plant and ecosystem function to inform forecasting and decision maker. And the most importantly maybe is that for the past 8 or 10 years, you've been building the field of agrivoltaics. And so you're going to present your work on this topic to build resilience in our ecosystems. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And thanks to everyone who helped organize this. This has been really the punch that I needed, ending this semester, going into the summer full of research. The reminder of just how critical this work is. Sometimes you do research for fun because it gets you excited, and sometimes it's because you're scared to death of what's happening otherwise, right? And to hear Sharon talk about the situation in the Western US, and to have Patrick highlight that great quote about trying to manage what we don't understand. Let's avoid these tipping points as best possible through the collaborative opportunities that we've been given. I've been trained as an ecologist and a biogeographer. And so I'm not in physics, I'm not in economics, I'm not a hydrologist by training. And I thought I was doing really well, patting myself on the back. I was working across all of these physical science disciplines to understand the nexus of challenges at our food, energy, and water systems. But if I've learned anything over the last decade, it's just how important it is for all of us as physical scientists to reach out and integrate our findings our work right from the beginning with the social scientists, with the economists, with the policymakers, so that we're working towards, an actually achievable goal. So I would also say that this work has been primed for international collaboration, thanks in part to my best French colleague, Régis, who we've been able to work across in France multiple times. I've been able to meet with people who are approaching this food and energy water challenge from a very similar point in the south of France. And I look forward to identifying the ways outcoming from this conference to keep that moving forward. Next slide, please. I'm sitting here tapping my button, wondering what's wrong and remembering I'm not in control. I'm not in control. So I agree that I think most of us recognize to avoid tipping points, we must work towards a sustainable development. Business as usual is no longer sustainable if it ever was. But where do we focus our efforts towards sustainable development? How do we strengthen that adaptation capacity and build resilience when we have different drivers and different needs? According to the United Nations, under Target 7, we're looking at this need for increased percentage of global renewable energy coming from renewable sources. Next slide, please. We also have this demand for increasing the efficiency of that renewable energy so that we can really come down on that curve that Patrick was showing us in terms of global emissions. But these incentives or these demands around energy sustainability aren't operating in a silo. They're not operating in isolation. We have these simultaneous needs for Target 2, which is looking at universal access to safe and nutritious food, because we have so many food deserts around the globe. Next slide, please. In addition, just producing food in these places is not enough. We have to increase the level of productivity in these lands. Part of that is through increasing infrastructure in rural places around the globe in terms of access to research and agricultural technology. And next slide, please. The last part of this is we're not just looking at energy or food in isolation. We have to do this with the constraint that we don't have clean water and access to water for sanitation in all places, but also because this resource is declining, as we've just been hearing about. So how do we balance tipping points that are happening in each one of these sustainable development realms. Next slide, please. Well, let's start with the energy part. Many of us want to increase the development of renewable energy out on our landscape, but even the renewable energy might be vulnerable to these tipping points, these climatic drivers we've been talking about. So if you're not familiar with the geography of the United States, we're down here in this dark red area, the southwestern part of the state. You might think that this is this map of the US and this map of France are thermal maps, but actually these are graphics illustrating the potential for photovoltaic or solar panel renewable energy production. And it's exactly that fact that the greatest productivity potential for renewable energy through photovoltaics is in some of the hottest lands that I'm showing this next graphic here. Oh, if you can go back one, thank you. This is an illustration of the efficiency of solar panels with temperature. And just let that sit in for a second. Anytime we're above, let's say comfortable 25 degrees Celsius, our solar panels are underperforming. And so if the best potential for capturing light is in these warmest lands, we're constantly underperforming. And so when will we even hit a tipping point in terms of when renewable energy production is possible in some of these lands? Next slide, please. Now, thankfully, anytime you follow Sharon Megdal in presenting, you know that you're going to hear about the water situation in the US. And so I'm also just going to jump right into France. So climate change is pushing us towards some tipping points in relation to water. What we're looking at here is under different climate change scenarios, the changes in the 95th percentile for dry spells. So what we're talking about here is the time between rain events or the times of short or longer term droughts. And you can see that, you know, quite a bit of France is going to end up being in periods of intermittent drought. And, you know, for the people, that might not mean such a big thing if you have access to water. But what about when you're talking about the farmers, the food producers? Next slide, please. And this is already hitting us here in the United States. As one state over to the west in California. And this is from the popular press, just the local newspaper. Low on water, California farmers are turning to solar farming. And so on one hand, you're like, great, they recognize this lack of water. They're still producing something for the good. Until you remember, we still need to balance energy production with food production. Otherwise, you know, we'll end up limiting ourselves. So how do we avoid this tipping point of needing to move out of food production and into energy production? Next slide, please. Well, we're saying, let's look at the potential, because we're worrying about these different tipping points, look for some synergies. And the co-location of vegetation and renewable energy can actually give us benefits across all 3 points of these systems: food, energy, and water. So on the left, you're looking at a typical solar installation in the Western United States. You can see they've gotten rid of the vegetation. And so out of that, you get energy production. The width of that band to each one of these resources represents the size of that resource. You look all the way to the right and you get food production. But you combine the two and you actually have the potential for energy production, food production, and increased revenue, because you're essentially harvesting the sun twice. The overstory for energy production and the understory for food production. And you also have this opportunity for water conservation. The point, and what's really in line with this conference, is that we need to look for opportunities for synergies along these realms of looking for avoiding tipping points. Next slide, please. So in this cartoon, I want to illustrate some of the ways that that might happen. Next slide, please. If you look at the left on slide A, this is an illustration of revegetating solar arrays with pollinator-friendly vegetation, like Rob Davis so brilliantly talked about yesterday. And in panel B, we're looking at revegetation with renewable energy and agriculture, like an intentional planting of our crops in the shade of solar. And you might be thinking, why? Why would you do such a thing? Well, this creating of this agrivoltaic system can help our food system survive through periods of drought and temperature stress. The plants are hiding in the shade of these solar panels, almost of an agroforestry kind of approach. Next slide, please. In terms of energy production, again, let's remember this graphic from a few minutes ago. And if we can actually take advantage of the fact that plants do transpiration, Just like our own skin does perspiration, we release water to create a localized cooling on our skin. Plants lose water through the process of transpiration, which creates localized cooling. Can we use that localized cooling represented by blue arrows in that cartoon to help cool down the solar panels, which I remember on this red arrow showing us means more efficient production of energy. And next slide, really just water. Ease our dependence on irrigation because we've reduced the level of evaporation. Just think about if you spilled your water bottle out in the shade versus the sun, where will it stay wet longer? In the shade. So let's take advantage of these simple principles. Next slide, please. So the question we always get, especially from funders, is can plants grow in the shade? And I like to point out, even Patrick, who took biology a long time ago as an economist, your teacher did not lie to you. Plants do require sunlight. This is true. But especially in high light environments, plants don't require all the sunlight that they receive. So next click. This yellow sun represents where we are in terms of the rates of photosynthesis per unit light. And because we have this curvilinear relationship between plants' need for light and their actual functioning, you can see that in this full sun environment, you can actually cut out 2/3 or even 3/4 of the level of light and still have significant photosynthetic productivity. And photosynthesis is important because that's how plants get the carbon to grow and reproduce. And next slide, please. Looking at that same rates of photosynthesis now across temperatures, you can see plants are like us. They don't love it cold, they don't love it hot, they love it somewhere in between. And so because in a shadier environment, it's cooler, you could actually push them more towards their optimal performance rate. So next point, please. It's really about, it's an economics question. Can a small reduction in photosynthetic capacity due to reduced light be offset by being grown in a better temperature environment? So this is our crazy idea, and let's see how well it's working so far. Next slide, please. We established what we call the Biosphere 2, which is that research facility in the background, the Agrivoltaics Learning Laboratory. This is our installation where at Biosphere 2, we see 110,000 visitors a year. So not only are we working with university professors and undergraduate students and graduate students, but we're showing this potential solution to tipping points to over 100,000 visitors a year. So it's an opportunity to translate our science and work with educators to think about how you best present information. Next slide, please. So now let's quickly walk through food, energy, and water. This is an illustration of several of our undergraduates from a couple of summers ago. In the bottom shows a little device we were using to measure photosynthetic rates in cabbage at the time. Next slide. Oh, it's already showing up. You can go ahead and hit next slide. What we're going to look at here is the photosynthetic rate throughout an entire day. And in all of my graphics, red is going to be open sun, like traditional agriculture, and blue will be agrivoltaics, grown under the shade of photovoltaics. And plants are green all day, but did you know that they're not actually functioning all day? At some point in traditional agriculture, shown here in red, they actually, the light of the sun comes out, they increase their performance dramatically, but they quickly turn off. So by mid-morning, when it's time, for your second cup of coffee, they go through what's called midday depression. It's just too hot and the atmosphere is too dry for them to continue to function. And our question was then, under photovoltaics in this agrivoltaic system, you can see that they're not peaking at the same maximum rates of photosynthesis, but is that offset by the fact that the microclimate remains cooler and more appropriate for their function? So that if you integrate under the area of these curves, you can actually see more production. So next slide, please. And so we measured cumulative measures of photosynthesis. Next slide, please. I realize I need to get going. We actually increased fruit production in multiple crop species in this experiment. And next slide, please. You can see that we've actually now worked across a bunch of different crop types and found quite a few synergies where the pluses are those synergies. 0 is neutral and a negative being a negative sign. And we can talk more about any of these that people are interested in later. Next slide, please. Now let's look at energy. Here we're looking at, through time, the daily swings in temperature of photovoltaic panels. And remember, this is important because high temperatures means low efficiencies. So next slide. you can see that on average, this blue line shows relative to the gray line, traditional solar panels, we cooled the solar panels by about 9 degrees Celsius. And not only is that important in terms of circular economy and thinking about, extending the lifetime of these panels, but next slide, please, that represented the fact that we actually were able to increase the efficiencies of these solar panels simply because we added solar food production underneath. Next slide, please. Finally, in terms of water, the microclimate under these solar panels was so significantly different that we increased the residency time of the irrigation. And so what we're looking at here is a time series of these pulses of soil moisture after every irrigation event. And you can see that the soil moisture levels in an agrivoltaic system, again here in blue, after 2 days was the same as it was in the red line after 2 to 3 hours in the control setting. So that rate of evaporation was so prolonged in an agrivoltaic setting that you were able to use less water to meet the same level of productivity. And so this led us to these next questions. Next slide, please. Can we actually reduce our irrigation water use because of this synergy? Simply co-locating photovoltaics over our food production could mean that we could still produce food with only a sliver of the previous irrigation requirements. And across the globe, can marginal lands now become arable lands? Next slide, please.
Greg, you have 1 more minute.
Okay, so all of this was, you can just go ahead and advance through them and I will follow you. This was produced recently in a paper. And so now we're looking beyond our borders. From Rob, you heard about agrivoltaics and food production and pollinator habitat. Our most exciting projects are working in East Africa, where we're looking at co-locating with green bean production, broccoli production, kale, and strawberries. And I'm the giant here in this photo with a bunch of folks from this farm in Kenya. And we're working with the University of Sheffield in England and actual Kenyan students to help us understand, what are the livelihood challenges that they're experiencing there. And I'll end with talking about the next slide, which is a project in another, this is illustration of how this project has actually come online now in the last few weeks. So go ahead, please. And we'll end with saying, now we're also establishing another project in the Arava Desert of Israel, another extreme environment where you would anticipate they're going to have trouble producing food and energy, especially off-grid in the future. And we've just established an agrivoltaic site there in the last 3 weeks, and they're beginning that project. And so I'll go ahead and stop on this slide. I'll just say the public is ready for a solution. It's up to us to figure out how to bring that solution to market, as Patrick would say. Thank you.